Good evening, peoples, and welcome back to my living room. I'm Pastor Leia, and this is, of course, Gingersnap, who is very excited to be on screen, as per usual. She really does like being on camera. She's very funny. So, since it is June, and last week we finished our 10-part series on the 10 Commandments. June is, of course, Pride Month, which means showing off my t-shirt that the cat is blocking. This pastor loves you. So I thought that we would do a very short 2-part series on some themes of pride. So tonight I wanted to read Acts 10, 9 through 16. I preached on this a couple years ago. It was very fun. I had lots of props. Anyway, so about noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up to the roof to pray, as you do. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heavens opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its 4 corners. In it were all kinds of 4-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice said to him again, a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. This is the word of the Lord. So a few verses later it repeats, "God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean." So I think it was maybe 2 years ago and change that I preached this, and I asked Carol to bring in some stuffed animals for me because I only own like 2, one of which is a corgi, a royal corgi from Edinburgh. See, it's got the royal seal on it. His name is Cornelius, so that I could call him Corny the Corgi for short. It seemed very important at the time. Entirely irrelevant. So I had all these stuffed animals on a white sheet, and so I read this story from Acts, and then our lady reader that morning helped me uncover the sheet to show all of these animals. It was very fun. Anyway, again, irrelevant. So, I think this is a really cool story. It feels very foreign to us because most of us have never followed kosher dietary laws. I know people who have, and I think it's fascinating to read up on, but I personally do not follow them. But I think it's still very important to remember that God has said that we are not to call anyone unclean or profane. We as human beings do kind of like to be judgy of others. It's kind of part of being human, and I am definitely not immune to this. I will confess, but I think it bears repeating, as it is repeated numerous times throughout the story. God tells us that we shall not call anyone profane or unclean. So, some fish. So there's this story that I truly hope is an urban legend, because if not, it's a very sad story. So there's this story that there's this family who every Sunday after they go to church, they go to a pet store and they buy a dozen goldfish. And they do this every week. And so after a while, the cashier is checking them out and asks, you come here every week and you buy a dozen goldfish. What are you doing with so many little fish? And so they say that, because they are Christian and because they want to celebrate the freedom of living in Christ and the glory of the earth, etc., every week they free these 12 goldfish by setting them loose in the ocean. And so the cashier is kind of horrified because goldfish are freshwater fish. And the ocean is kind of salty, to put it mildly. And so essentially it's like, you're killing these fish. Why are you murdering fish? You mean people. Why do you hate fish so much? But of course his family is horrified to hear this and doesn't want to believe it. And so they keep on doing it because they don't want to believe that they have been killing fish this whole time. So there are many definitions of what it means to be a moral or ethical person. The story is an illustration of why I would like to define the goal of living an ethical life to treat others as well as possible, and also to be informed of what their needs might be. You can have the greatest intentions ever, but if you don't know what the actual needs of a community are, then you are not fulfilling your ethical obligation to help them. So, so many slides, and they're all very small font. So, with that being said, in the before times, I had like just plotted out like the majority of the calendar year for 2020, and I had like plans for like adult ed classes and like Bible studies planned out through like most of the year, and like all these things. It was a great plan, and then 2020 happened. Y'all were there. But one of the things that I was looking forward to was that in June I was going to do a version of this presentation as a refresher course, and I was going to start doing that annually to celebrate Pride Month. So, without further ado, I thought we'd go through a bit of a vocabulary lesson because this is a rather large acronym. That was an interesting brain. Anyway, or is it an initialism? It was an initialism because NASA is an acronym and LGBTQIA is not the point. So LGBTQIA. Sometimes I accidentally stick a U in there just because U's and Q's are friends, but that is neither here nor there. So we're going to go through this list. So the terms in this list are a mix of gender identities and sexual orientations. So this is the genderbread person, which is kind of a cutesy illustration of the differences between these terms. So your gender identity or identity in general is in your brain. So it's a very colorful brain here. So that is your identity. The heart is for attraction or sexual orientation, who your heart is thumping or twitter-pated for was the word from Bambi. Sex or biological sex is in the crotch area. And then all of this is expression, how you express yourself. So you can have any mix of things on this genderbread cookie or a person, or it's a cutesy illustration, but that's just a brief little, anyway, there's difference between these terms. So, L, lesbian, is a sexual orientation. Lesbian is a woman who is attracted to other women. It comes from the Isle of Lesbos, which is where an ancient Greek poet called Sappho was writing in like forever ago. I forget what century. I read her in college, and she's got these really lovely poems, and throughout them there's these great themes about time and the fragility of it, but also kind of these subtle odes of love to another woman. And so Sappho is very much an icon of certain people. I once knew a hamster named Sappho who belonged to a gay friend of mine in college. Anyway, so the word lesbian comes from the Isle of Lesbos, where she lived. So gay is a bit more, bit less specific. It can refer specifically to men who are attracted to men. It can also mean like anybody who is attracted to people of the same gender. It can be a bit of a catch-all. For my generation, I have perhaps most often used this, or not used, heard this as a synonym for stupid. So it's not like my least favorite word. It's also not my favorite word, just because I've heard it used so often that way, and have come out pretty hard with a stance that I am not willing to be friends with someone who uses this word as a synonym for stupid, because honestly, there's so many different words for stupid, like just honestly. So B, bisexual, is another sexual orientation, is a person who can be attracted to a person either of their own gender or of another gender, not necessarily at the same time. Again, I'm an old maid, but I like to think that if I were married, I could potentially be attracted to any of a number of humans, but I have chosen to commit myself to this one person who hypothetically is my spouse. So a bisexual person isn't inherently unsatisfied just because they're in a relationship with one person. This can be harder for some people to understand, even within the community. There's a lot of, it's just a phase, or you haven't come all the way out as lesbian yet. And very frustrating, but these people do exist, and they should not be erased. So T for trans with an asterisk, because it stands for a number of words. So the asterisk is an umbrella for trans man, trans woman, transgender, or transsexual. Transsexual isn't used as often in more recent generations. Some people still use it. So this is a trickier one. So the biological sex that they were born with is not the one that feels right to them. So this can be a harder one for people to understand because they think, well, what you would naturally think would be if I were trying to convince the world that I were a man. But really it's, I have always been a woman, and so I need to convince the world to see me as a woman the way that I see myself. So it's a bit of a reframing of that metaphor. Anyway, reshifting of that. I've had a number of trans friends. People also often want to ask whether they've had surgery yet, which I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but generally speaking, in polite conversation, don't ask people about their genitalia. Like, I shouldn't have to say that. But this like often happens like in very public TV interviews. Also, why? Not the point. And well, this also is not the point because surgery is a large thing to undergo. It's also really expensive and very often not covered by insurance. So top surgery is less expensive. So I've known people who have only gone through that, or who can only afford to go through that, or who were only willing to go through that, because there can be a lot of physical complications of major surgery that, anyway, yeah, so in short, don't ask people about their genitalia or ask if they've undergone surgery. It's really, that's not small talk. So, on to Q. Now, I know that for the majority of people who are watching this, you're going to be older than me. I'm assuming. So for people older than me, this is not a good word. Has very much been used and heard as a slur. And I know that when I go through these letters with people, especially a couple generations older than me, there are quite a few raised eyebrows when I get here, because they see queer as very much used as an insult, which in previous generations, yes, it was. For people closer to my age, it's being reclaimed. I like that this covers all of the letters. It's a lot less of a mouthful. It's, just the one syllable and not all of the syllables on half of the alphabet. So queer can be either a sexual orientation or a gender identity. And so I like the word queer because it can cover both, and it's just good all-purpose word. But again, to quite a lot of people, this is not a good word. And so, let people choose their own words to describe themselves, basically. But I do understand that this is not a good word to many people. But I have many friends of roughly my own age who do use this word to describe themselves. So Q can also stand for questioning. This can be, there's a lot to process within all of these letters. And some people might not be living in a community where they are comfortable coming out, or where they realize that these are even things that exist. And so there's just a feeling in the back of their heads of, I am not like the other people. Why is that? How is that? What is going on? We have such a widespread assumption in Western civilization that people are going to be straight and are going to identify in the bodies that they were assigned at birth. And that's just such a deeply ingrained assumption that it's really a shift in one's own head to be like, no, that's not true for me though. So anyway, questioning can be either sexual orientation or gender identity. So intersex is a person with indeterminate genitalia. There have been previous generations where doctors would assign one or the other at birth and do surgery on a newborn, which has tended not to go over very well as people have grown up. I didn't think to look up the statistics for this earlier this afternoon, but more people than you would think either have indeterminate genitalia or indeterminate chromosomes. And so that is a gender identity. They can be straight or gay or lesbian or whatever. It's a gender thing. So on to the A. Asexual is a person who is not attracted to other people. This is different from celibacy, which is the deliberate choice not to be in a relationship with someone or sexually active. Asexual is just not really having the interest in that. There's also subcategories. There's aromantic, etc. And asexual people can still have long-term relationships. They just function a bit differently. Asexuals also tend to get forgotten in this rainbow alphabet soup. So now I wanted to go through some dates, some fun dates. So the word homosexual was first coined in 1869, which is fairly recent in the scheme of things. Of course, there have been what we would consider to be homosexual persons for many years before 1869, but this word, the concept of a sexual orientation, doesn't exist until really just a few generations ago. And so there might be other words or terminology or euphemism used, but historically speaking, the concept of sexual orientation doesn't exist until the 19th century. So it might be 100% accurate to say that, a historical figure engaged in relations with someone of their own gender. Historically and linguistically speaking, it might not be 100% accurate to define them or describe them as homosexual because that wasn't a concept that existed yet. Anyway, so as the opposite of homosexual, heterosexual was coined in 1886, which is a while after, because it didn't need to be a word because there wasn't a concept of sexual orientation. So I just think this is really interesting. So in 1952, the American Psychiatric Association described homosexuality as a, and I quote, sociopathic personality disturbance. So this was before my mom was born, so this was a while ago, but I always grew up with a copy of the DSM, the Diagnostic something or other manual. We just call it the DSM. My mom's a psychologist, and I've worked for psychologists and psychiatrists, and so there's always been DSM around. So in 1968, the DSM downgraded homosexuality to a non-psychotic disorder, which, gosh, thank you, so generous. But to be fair, within 16 years, that is a pretty big shift in thinking from a sociopathic personality disturbance to a non-psychotic disorder as we come to understand people better and talk about things more openly. So as of 1973, the American Psychiatric Association no longer considers homosexuality to be a mental disorder. 1973, which is a bit longer ago than I would think would have happened given how wider society treats people, but we're always gonna anyway. So, a bit more church specific. The General Assembly is the big group of the Presbyterians who get together every 2 years. If you're not as familiar with the Presbyterian structure, we have presbyteries, which were a bit like a diocese in the Catholic tradition, or something more like a county, like a bunch of local area churches. So our presbytery is the general area of Detroit. I think there's a couple smaller states where the presbytery is just the state. Anyway, so it's so the presbytery is like a county or diocese, and then the General Assembly, which meets every other year, is like all of them in the United States. So in 1978, our General Assembly said, homosexuality is not God's wish for humanity. This was not one of the brightest moments in our history. So in 1993, now we're in the era of history that I did live through. Don't Ask, Don't Tell happened, which was a policy in the military that I never understood the reason for, that you could be gay. You just, if anyone knew, then shoo. And like thousands of people were discharged from the military for this reason. And hey, you just gonna sit there and look at me, or are you coming back up? We have a deal. I fed you early so that you could be part of this. You're my co-host. So that was 93. So in 1996, really doubling down on this, the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, decided that marriage was only between one man and one woman, which, and I've mentioned this before, but there are quite a number of people who genuinely believe that Christian marriage is only between a man and a woman, and I genuinely do not understand where you find that in the Bible. There's so much polygamy in the Bible that not the point. So in 1998, More Light Presbyterians was founded. So More Light is, I like to call it the Gay Straight Alliance of the Presbyterian Church. So before the national denomination was openly affirming, More Light was a coalition of churches within the denomination that were. We did vote to join More Light in the before times, and then the plague hit, and we kind of haven't gotten around to sending in the paperwork, in short. So yeah. So in 2008, Proposition 8 passed in California. For those of you who are not from California, like myself, I grew up there. Proposition 8, for a brief shining moment, we had marriage equality in California as decided by the courts, and then there was a law passed that took away the rights of a minority group, which is, I was going to say unprecedented, but I'm really sick of the word unprecedented after the past year and a half. But like that hadn't happened before, in short. So this is a vintage picture of me in 2008. I'm like 20 and very young and idealistic. So before the election, I went to a protest with this big sign that I was holding up. So a week or so before this particular protest, I had approached a friend of mine who was in leadership of the campus GSA, the Gay Straight Alliance. And I was like, hey, how can I help with this? And this was a person that I'd always thought was like really cool. We weren't like super, super close. I think we lived in the same dorm both years. Yeah, I'm a sophomore at this point. And, but not super close. And I will never forget that what they said was that I had, and I quote, come out of the woodwork, because they assumed that because they knew I was Christian and wanted to be a pastor, that I was kind of okay with them as a person, but didn't approve of them fundamentally. And I think about that a lot, because it just breaks my heart to think that that would be somebody's assumption of the church, or of me specifically, but just of the church. I mean, people wonder why my generation doesn't statistically go to church as often, and that's why. Because people think that the church is that exclusionary. Anyway, so on this day, here I am decked out in my Prop 8 pin and big sign, and there were cars that drove past us on the corner that rolled down their windows and spat on us and yelled and screamed at us. And to be fair, there were also plenty of cars who rolled down their windows to, say something in support. And it was just a very emotionally overwhelming day, because I'd never been spat on before and haven't been since. And it never occurred to me at the age of 20 that we would see marriage equality in my lifetime, because I will never forget the experience of being spat on for saying that people deserved equality. So in 2010, I was still in college at this point. the PCUSA allowed for partnered gay and lesbian pastors to be ordained. So technically before this, the language I think was the pastors had to be either married or chaste in singleness, or some weird phrasing with the word chaste in it. But that language was changed because marriage equality was not the case everywhere. And so in 2010, that happened. So then in 2011, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, so that was cool. In 2014, the PCUSA allowed pastors to officiate all legal marriages. That was before 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges, when the Supreme Court decided that everybody gets marriage equality. It was a great day. I was working at a nonprofit at the time, and I was just sitting in my office just sobbing because I never thought I would see that, and certainly not 7 years after being spat on in the street for saying that maybe this was a thing that we should consider. So that was a good day. So on to some depressing statistics, because I feel like there should be depressing statistics in this presentation. 42% of LGBT youth say that their community is not accepting. That's a statistic from the HRC, the Human Rights Coalition. These are numbers that I pulled up, I want to say a year and a half ago, so they're recent. 29% of LGBT youths attempted suicide in the past year. That is almost 1/3, compared to 6% of straight youths. That is a huge difference in numbers. So LGBT people are, and that's a statistic from the CDC, LGBT people are targeted for violent hate crimes at a rate of 2 times that of Muslims or Black people, 4 times that of Jews, and 14 times that of Latinos. Humans can be awful to each other. That's a statistic from the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center. More sad statistics. LGBT youth who reported higher levels of family rejection during adolescence are 3 times more likely to use illegal drugs. From PFLAG NYC, parents and family of lesbians and gays, I think, is that acronym. I have absolutely known people in my life who have been entirely disowned from their families for coming out as teenagers. So half of gay males experience a negative parental reaction when they come out, and in 26% of those cases, the youth was thrown out of the home. $1.6 million young people experience homelessness in the US every year. That's from the Washington Post. So that statistic means that 400,000 to 800,000 young people are homeless because they have been rejected by their families and or communities. We could significantly reduce the numbers of young homeless people by not being jerks. I mean, in many ways that fact is true, but I mean, statistically. When I lived in Washington, D.C. after college, I was with a nonprofit that was working to end the cycle of homelessness. So we had job training programs and low-income housing and all sorts of things. And so I have known and met a lot of homeless people. And the idea that someone younger than me could be homeless because their family didn't want them is just awful, beyond awful. Humanity deserves better than that. Kids deserve better than that. We should do better. And there are some things that I don't understand, in short. So to go back to our Acts reading from earlier, God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. If you want to believe that homosexuality is a sin, I mean, I would love to discuss that with you over coffee and disagree with you. But we can't turn people away because we don't like something that they do or something that they are. And that's not a matter of not liking someone or thinking that they're sinning. That's a matter of potentially saving their life. I mean, if if we as the church are adding to the message that people aren't good enough or are fundamentally broken or wrong or disgusting, then we are personally contributing to that statistic that 29% of LGBT youth will commit suicide in any given year. And I don't think Jesus wants that. In short, I don't think Jesus wants that. Anyway, so now that I've made everyone sad with those statistics, this pastor loves you. And Jesus loves you too, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, no matter who you love. And more love in this world is always a good thing. So anyway, cute cat on camera. So I hope to see some of you tomorrow night for our Wednesday evening prayer. And of course on Thursday afternoon for our time of fellowship over Zoom. So with that being said, good night from me and Gingersnap. We hope that you are all doing well and being fabulous.